Good morning or afternoon, depending on where you're logging in from today. My name is Carrie Simpson. I'm the CEO of Managed Sales Pros. Can everybody or just anybody let me know if you can hear me okay today? A little bit of housekeeping. On the right-hand side of the screen, you should see a panel where you can type in questions or chat with me or chat with other people. I haven't been using this particular webinar platform that long, so I'm going to ask you a couple of super boring housekeeping questions. One, can you see the slides okay? Are the slides bigger than my face, or is my face bigger than the slides? Or can you only see one or the other? Well, I'm starting anyway, so if you can't see my camera or the slides, then it's going to be a really boring webinar for you. If you can only see me, well, lucky you. And if you can only see the slides, you'll still get all the benefits. So if there is a problem sometime throughout the programming, for those of you who don't know, I'm currently living in Puerto Vallarta, where the Wi-Fi could be described as questionable on good days. So if we lose the connection at some point, everybody will get a copy of this afterwards. And if for some reason the Wi-Fi just dies completely, I will re-record it and send it to you. So with that said, let's get started. One of the things that I'm finding really interesting right now, as I've done a couple of consulting engagements over the last quarter, is people are forecasting really aggressively for 2021. And I find that interesting because the companies that are forecasting really aggressively for 2021 didn't forecast at all for 2020 or for 2019. So they're forecasting based on absolutely no historical data. They're pulling numbers out of the air. And as somebody who's been running a business for 7 years and who prefers the magical pull numbers out of the air approach to goal setting, I totally understand why they're doing that. However, what I learned when I magically pulled goals out of the air for my team to hit was that it was demoralizing, demotivating, and ultimately incorrect. It didn't allow me to staff properly, and it didn't tell me when I might need to, for example, add people onto my calling team. So obviously my company and your company are not identical, but the principles are the same, and sales forecasting is pretty much the same, whether you're a cold calling company or a managed services company. And since we work with managed services companies, we help them predict what their sales are going to look like next year. So the biggest difference between what your forecast would have looked like for 2000, let's just say that 2020 was a dumpster fire and we all wish it hadn't happened, but here we are now and we have to pivot and move forward and work with what we have. So lots of companies didn't survive the pandemic. I'm grateful that mine did. I'm sure you're grateful that yours has. And I'm sure you'd like it to survive well past the pandemic. Proper forecasting is going to help you make sure that you're not disproportionately attributing money to team members that you may not need based on a sales forecast that isn't accurate. And it's also going to help you provide your team with a realistic snapshot of what can be achieved next year. So these are the points that I want to go over, and some of the points that I based the projections that I've, best guesstimated for next year. One, remote meetings are easier to schedule than their on-site counterparts. Remote meetings also have a higher no-show rate than their in-person counterparts. They also have lower conversion rates than their in-person counterparts. And unfortunately, remote meetings are not going away anytime soon. I know that we've all seen the news about the vaccines. I think that the first person vaccinated in Canada was a friend of mine. So the vaccines are here, but they're going to get rolled out slowly. And I think the prospects are still going to prefer a remote meeting. And your team may also prefer a remote meeting. So the idea of forcing your team, for example, to go meet face-to-face and potentially expose themselves to this virus isn't going to be a great culture or HR practice. So I think they're here to stay for a little while, probably until 2023, whether we like it or not. So these remote meetings are going to skew all of your key performance indicators if you haven't taken into account or measured the difference between what on-site meetings provided for you and what in-person meetings provided for you. And since we're a company that does nothing but schedule meetings, I actually have a lot of data around the difference between what our appointment setting services looked like when we were setting only in-person meetings compared to pivoting to phone calls and Zoom meetings and whatever we could get. So sales forecasting isn't really a science, right? If you did, let's say you had a great year, like 2019 was one of the best years we'd ever had. No, we did 60% growth, and it was easy to assume that we could do 60% growth in the following year. And that's what I was expecting. Like I was going to get my Inc. base year and a hell of a lot more than that. And I was obviously very surprised when the pandemic hit, like everybody else was. We had the best Q1 we'd ever had. So even looking at the forecasting that I had done for 2020, I blew my Q1 numbers out of the water, and I was super aggressive about what the rest of the year was going to look like. I was like, great, we projected a 60% year. Looks like we're going to do 80%. Like, that's pretty good. And then boom, the bottom fell out of the basket, and now we're all scrambling to play catch up. So sales forecasting can be close to what you're going to hit, or it could be nowhere near what you're going to hit. And it really depends on how much historical data you have and really how good you are at it. It's mostly best guesses, right? So if you're a data analyst, you're probably a whole lot better than forecasting than, some person who manages a cold calling company who only learned how to read her P&L 3 years ago. So my sales forecasting skills are not very good to begin with. And if you are a new MSP or a growing MSP who really hasn't done a lot of sales forecasting, if you haven't tracked and measured everything that you've done for the past few years very meticulously, you won't have any numbers to base your forecasts on. So you're just kind of pulling them out of the air. So my first thought to you is, if you're going to pull numbers out of the air, make sure that they're at least realistic enough that your team can hit them. 2019 looked like this, and I've used one particular client here, a client that's been with us for multiple years, because I thought that was the most realistic way to do this. I couldn't really look at a client that had only been with us for 6 months, and I wanted to look at one of our clients that does pretty well, not our best client, not the worst client we've ever had, but somewhere in the middle with a decent closing ratio so that we could use some numbers that were kind of realistic. So 2019 looked like this for this client. They have a half-time caller with us, 13,000 dials, 520 conversations with decision makers, 40 appointments scheduled, 0% no-show rate. So 40 appointments, 30 of them went to quote, 12 of them became deals, and that translated into 360 seats of new business. Right, so their sales and marketing expense, and again, I'm only looking at cold calling, so this is not going to be scientific when you take into account all of the other things that need to go into your sales forecasting. But for our purposes today, cold calling only, sales asset only, I think it's pretty bang on. So it cost them $72,000 to work with us, which means their cost per lead was $1,800. So a lead is an appointment in our terminology. So if we're using the same language, lead means appointment. Their cost of acquisition was $6,000. So for every $6,000 they spent, they signed one new piece of business. So their cost per seat was $200. Not bad. I like to look at it as like the lifetime value of a client is $2.1 million in this scenario. So new MRR for them, $61,000. 3-year term, that's the kind of contracts they sign. That's a $2.1 million lifetime value. And they put about 18 points to the bottom line. So profit on these campaigns is $178,000. So depending on how you want to measure things, if you want to look at what goes to the bottom versus what goes to the top, they're still doing okay. They're doubling their investment for profit, and they're doing significantly better than that for top line. Let's look at 2020. 13,000 dials, 640 conversations, 72 appointments, 15 of them didn't show up. That means they got 32 appointments. That number doesn't look right. That was a 15% no-show rate. So that number is incorrect. I apologize. They got 32 appointments total. 24 of them went to quote. They only won 7. And remember, their closing ratio is usually significantly higher. They won 245 seats for $44,000 in MRR, lifetime value of 1.6. And because I know this company, I know that their margins dropped to 12%. So their profit was only 192. We gave them a discount for staying through the pandemic. So their cost per asset for the year was $60,000, making their cost per appointment $1,875, and their cost per acquisition $8,500, and their cost per seat $244. So if I just looked at number of appointments scheduled, for example, that number jumped, right? If we were being measured only on how many appointments we could schedule for our clients, if I wasn't going to talk about the rest of it, I look like I'm having a great year. We look like a great company, right? We went from 60 appointments the year before to 72 this year. So we increased by 1 appointment a month. Not bad. And we also charged them less, even better. But if you look at all of the other numbers together, it was significantly worse for them. It cost them far more to sign each company that they did sign. Their closing ratio went down, and our no-show rate jumped. So our no-show rate has historically been 0% on the managed services side of our business because we give the prospect so many opportunities to back out of the appointment. We qualify it again, we qualify it on budget, we make sure the prospect understands that the reason that they are meeting with this person is to replace whatever it is that they're doing for IT support currently. So we don't have any no-shows in normal years on our managed services appointments. This year, we had a lot of no-shows. So looking at the difference between, what are the variables? The same caller works on this account. They made the same number of phone calls because they're measured to that, and they don't hit bonus if they don't hit their numbers. So they always hit their numbers. The only real variable is we are scheduling remote appointments as opposed to in-person appointments. So these numbers aren't real, right? So that's not really what their year looked like at all. What I did to look at these numbers, which is a lot like sales forecasting, was I said, okay, we can't look at Q1 because Q1 was more like 2019. We had a great Q1. We had in-person meetings. Everything was great. And then we had a couple of months for this client where we just suspended calling completely because they were so busy pivoting their current clients to home-based that they didn't want any new sales appointments. So we're like, you know what, whatever, we'll just stop calling. So I can't take those months into account because that skews the numbers. So then they took a quarter of remote appointments. I took that quarter and I expanded it into the year. So those numbers aren't real. That's a sales forecast. That is a projection, right? That didn't happen. And it was almost impossible to come up with what their numbers actually look like because they doubled their calling at the end of the year. They didn't do any calling in the middle of the year. There was they had a fantastic Q1 and double the assets on Q4. So to create a snapshot of what that equivalent calling would look like, 2019 to 2020, it was impossible. And it'll be impossible for everybody. Everyone's going to have the same problem. You can't forecast using your Q1 numbers. You can't forecast using your Q2 numbers. Your Q3 and 4 numbers are probably a more realistic snapshot of what next year is going to look like. So are you going to eliminate, what part of your forecast do you eliminate? You can't go back to 2019 and use those numbers. So we're looking at a brand new kind of unprecedented forecasting year. You can't really go back 3 years and average things, and you can't really add in an aggressive growth goal. So what are we going to do this year? So as we consider moving forward in forecasting, Remote meetings are going to be the new normal, and they're going to be the new normal for a while. So I wouldn't include your numbers from any month where you were doing in-person meetings, because you're not going to do any next year. Or if you are, they're going to be few and far between. And I would again think about whether or not your staff wants to be exposed to in-person meetings, even if it becomes acceptable. So from a culture standpoint and from a respecting your prospect standpoint, like, both companies are going to have to be 100% comfortable with an in-person meeting before an in-person meeting is going to be anything but awkward. How are we conducting them now? Are we shaking hands again? I don't even know, right? We haven't done them for a while. So I also feel like you're not going to be as good at them. You just spent a year getting good at meeting with people online. We've seen the results. Like, they don't show up as often. And personally, I believe that there is an etiquette thing around that. When you bring someone into your office, or you invite somebody into your office, it's really hard to kick them out of your office, right? They come in and you have to meet with them. You have to be polite. Even if you don't really want to take the meeting after about minute 10, you've given them an hour, you have to hear them out. So people think very carefully before they allow somebody to come into their building and sit in their office. Whereas committing to a Zoom meeting, yeah, sure, no problem. Like, I want you to think right now about the number of Zoom meetings you blew off this year, the number of webinars you said you'd go to, or the number of events you said you'd attend, you just didn't bother going. Whereas if your friend said, hey, are you going to come to my networking event that I invited you to on Tuesday? And you said yes, you're probably going to go because your friend's expecting you to be there. Your friend's going to drive there. And if you don't show up, they're going to be offended. It's probably not that offended if you don't come to the Zoom meeting, right? There's no effort required. You don't have to do anything. You don't even have to get dressed. I'm wearing a bathing suit. So, no, I don't have to put a lot of effort into going to a webinar. Whereas if I'm going to go to a business meeting, I'm going to have to dress appropriately. I'm going to drive across town. I'm going to do a whole bunch of things to prepare that I don't have to do before I have a web meeting. So people are accepting more of them and they're attending less of them. And that's going to affect your numbers next year. Remove all of the months where you had no sales activity, unless those months are traditionally not sales months for you anyway. Like, for myself, I take every summer off. So I can't really include my summer numbers in my forecast because there aren't any. There never are. I don't work during the summer. So if you have months like that, you can remove them from your forecast for next year. But if you just stopped doing anything while you scrambled to figure out what we were going to do for the pandemic, those months can't really be forecasted either. And then one more thing to consider: if you furloughed or terminated a sales asset during the pandemic and haven't replaced them, you can't forecast using their activity numbers either, because they're no longer there and someone else is going to have to make those calls. So if you've got numbers based on having a sales rep last year and you're forecasting using the numbers that your sales rep hit, but now you're the one doing the calling and you're not consistent about it, those numbers aren't going to be accurate. So it brings us to a whole conundrum about how we're going to figure out what our businesses are going to look like next year. And one of the things that I've really been trying to drive home as I've had conversations with IT firms is that 2021 is not the year for you to hit your BHAG, right? And if you don't know what BHAG is, it's a big, hairy, audacious goal. It's a term that a couple of the strategic planning groups use. You could use it, this isn't a stretch goal year, all right? This is a year where we want to stay in business. We want to maintain our client base at all costs. So preserve your revenue. First and foremost, you don't want to lose any clients this year. So anytime you aggressively sell, anytime you focus anything you focus on improves, but everything else goes to shit a little bit for a while. So if you're going to focus aggressively on trying to grow your business this year, remember that you're going to lose clients. So if you had to choose between aggressively growing your sales this year and preserving the revenue that you already had and growing your base, I would consider this year a year to preserve your base at all costs, because we don't know what's going to happen next. And you want all your clients to stay with you. So you don't want your competitors scooping them while you're out trying to win new business. This is a bird in the hand year. This is a year to think about process. How can you create and follow an intentional sales and marketing plan? So if you haven't had one traditionally and you're looking at sales forecasting now and you're pulling numbers out of the air and you don't know what activities lead to sales, you don't know where your highest and best percentage shot at winning new business is, it's time for you to figure that out, because you're not going to be able to ever forecast effectively if you don't know where your money comes from and how long it takes to drop into your pipeline. Measure everything this year. So you got a brand new year coming up. You're going to have a New Year's resolution where it comes to sales and marketing. Measure everything. So you're going to be able to forecast better in 2022. 2021 isn't going to be a referral year either. So if you've built your business on referrals and right now you can't figure out why you're not signing new business, it's because there's no networking events to go to, right? Even if there are networking events next year, no one's going to them. The people that are going to them maybe shouldn't be. Virtual meeting fatigue has set in. We're all going to less stuff. I don't go to virtual meetings. When the pandemic first started, there used to be this like channel chief coffee thing. And I went every week because I missed the people that I was no longer seeing on the road. But then it got tiring and now I don't go at all, right? So there's lots of networking events online and people aren't going to them anymore. So getting new business from virtual BNI events or virtual whatever kind of networking events there are going on in your community, that's going to decrease, not increase. Online fatigue has hit all of us, right? So we're not on, like personally, I'm not on social media nearly as much as I was a few years ago. I have to spend all of my business hours online now. So when I'm done, I don't want to go online later. I'm not interacting with people on Facebook the way I used to. So even if I knew of somebody who was looking for IT support, I doubt very much I'd have a conversation with another person about it at this point. So what happens now? What do you do next? So here's my best guess for a company that decides to hire an in-house caller right now. So again, forecasting, best guess. This is a full-time caller, so 26,000 dials. 1,200-ish conversations with decision makers, 144 appointments, 30 of them are going to no-show, 64 appointments. Sorry, I need to put my glasses on. 48 of them will go to quote. You're going to win 14 of them. It's going to be 490 seats, $88,200 worth of new MRR, 3.2 million in lifetime value, of which at, I can't remember if I did this at 12 or 18%, but $384,000 of that will be profit. You're going to pay that asset $40,000 a year. So your cost per lead in this scenario is $625. Your cost per appointment is almost $3,000. And your cost per seat is $82. So what are we assuming? We're assuming that they already had a performing full-time agent, right? So the person that's working for that company has already been with them for a couple of years. So that's the first thing that we're considering in this particular forecast is they already have a caller that knows what they're doing. And we took into consideration 100% remote meetings versus in-person meetings, the no-show rate that comes along with that, and the lower closing ratio that comes with those remote meetings. And this assumes that you actually tracked any of those things previously, so you have some historical data to base it on. So I'm basing these numbers on the client that I know, or clients that I know, who were willing to share things with me. It also assumes that you only use the remote demo months to create this projection. So you didn't cheat and use 2 quarters worth of in-person meetings. You only looked at the 3 months that you did 100% remote meetings. And then you used your worst closing ratio, not your best. So if your best month had a closing ratio of 1 and 2, and you had a 0% no-show rate, that's not the month you're using to project for 2021. You're using the one where you had the worst results. And this assumes you're not adding a growth goal for this year. This assumes you're just trying to stay at the same pace that you grew at last year, right? You just want to do what you did last year. You're not trying to like knock it out of the park. You're not going to hire another sales rep. You're not going to do anything but exactly what you did this year. You're going to hold and maintain as opposed to try to double in size this year. So let's assume you don't have that asset and you're going to hire someone this year. And let's say you've got a pipeline of potential hires, or maybe you're just posted a sales ad today, right? 13,000 dials, 320 conversations, 12 appointments. 3 of them don't show up, which gives you 9 appointments. 6 of them go to quote. You win 2 of them. You get 60 new seats. For $10,000 of monthly recurring, lifetime value of $367,000, profit is $48,000 off that. You're paying your caller $40,000, your cost per lead is $3,400, and your cost per appointment is $20,000. So your cost per seat is $667. So this is the first year of a multi-year engagement with a sales rep. This is not unrealistic, and this is not as scary as it looks. You have to assume a few things. Like one, you start hiring today, right? You post that ad today. And if you don't know how to write a job ad, you don't post an ad until you know how to write a job ad. If you don't know how to interview, you don't post a job ad until you know how to interview. And if you don't have a sales and marketing process for your new hire to follow, you don't post an ad at all, right? The worst thing you can do for your business right now is hire somebody and put them in a corner and give them a list and leave them on their own, right? If you don't have the time and inclination to support a new cold caller, bringing a cold caller into your company is going to be the worst thing you've ever done. And that person is going to rotate out of your business. You're going to hire and fire constantly. Like our longevity rate for callers is about 18 months, but that's recent. Like that's in the last 2 years. Before that, we had a revolving door. We developed a process that doesn't hurt us when we have a revolving door agent, but it will definitely hurt your business because everything you just did, all the groundwork you just laid, drops right out of the bottom again, and you have to start over again. And if you don't have a process for that revolving door agent to follow, so let's say you've got to hire every 3 to 6 months. If you haven't defined a clear process where the person that you hire next can sit down in the chair that the last person was sitting in and just pick up where they left off, it's just going to be constantly Groundhog Day. You're just throwing $40,000 into the paper shredder. It's not time to do it. If you planned, prepared, and you're ready, now it's time to start advertising for that sales rep. So you have to assume that that asset doesn't quit and that they aren't an enormous HR problem, and they actually do the job that you hire them to do. And they're not like, you're not promising them that they're going to be a sales rep if they are a good cold caller within 6 months, because that's not going to happen. Right? You want to hire a cold caller and you want to make them into a better cold caller. You don't want to dangle a better job in front of someone and make them do a job that they don't want. People who get hired to do jobs that they don't want mark time until they maybe get the job that they do want. But most often they do the job that you hired them for so badly that they never get to the job that they want. So don't damage your business by bringing in somebody that you're not prepared to support and that you haven't prepared yourself for. Right? If you don't have your CRM set up properly, you don't hire somebody and expect them to build the process that they're going to follow. You create a process, you hire someone, and you teach them how to follow it. It's your company, it's your process. You're not hiring a sales leader, you're hiring a worker bee. Somebody who's going to come in and do the things that you tell them to do in the order that you want them done in. And if they don't do that, you're going to counsel them. And if they don't do it again, you're going to counsel them again. And if they don't do it again, you're going to fire them and start over. We see a lot of people hiring cold callers because they have experience, right? They worked for somebody else for 4 years, so they're going to be great. Except that they worked for someone else where they had a guardrails and a defined process and where they understood their job and they understood everything that they needed to do and they understood how to get better. They understood what they were measured against and what they're supposed to do when they come to work in the morning and what they're supposed to do when they log out at night. If you don't have that from A to Z planned out already, it's not time for you to bring someone in. This also assumes that you hire somebody and the only thing that they do all day is cold call. They're not doing research on LinkedIn. You're not letting them manage your social media. You're not doing anything but having them call all day. That's their job. That's their entire job. Otherwise, those numbers aren't actual. They aren't actual anyway because forecasting is a best guess. So let's take that same sales hire. Let's say you managed to hire someone good and you prepared for it, you planned for it. It's year 2 and they're still with you and they're getting better. Fantastic. That's what we want. Right? So this year, they have a full year of calling to do. So last year, we were 6 months. We took 3 months to hire them and build our process. And then we took 3 months to train, onboard, and make sure everything was dialed in properly. Then they had 6 months of full-time calling. Now we've got a 26,000 dial year. We're going to talk to 620 decision makers. We're going to have 68 appointments. 12 of them aren't going to show up, which gives us 48 appointments. 36 of them are going to go to quote. We're going to win 12. That's 360 seats for $61,200 in MRR, 2.2 million in lifetime, and a profit of 330. You've given him a bit of a raise because he stuck around for a year and he's doing a good job. So now your cost per lead is $1,041. And your cost of acquisition is $4,200. So every client you sign costs $4,200. Every seat you sign, which is an easy way to look at it, costs you $140. So if you think about it in terms of, I want to grow my business by 8,000 seats. Well, if you know that every seat you sign costs you $140, now you know what you need to do to get to and how much it's going to cost you to get to the number of seats that you want. In this scenario only, which has some assumptions. It assumes that you've got an experienced rep that's making 50 grand. So here we are. We're assuming that we're going to keep that guy. We're assuming that most prospects are going to prefer to remain remote. So we're still scheduling nothing but remote, and the no-show rate is going to stay high. You've given him a raise or you've added variable compensation. And again, his only job is cold calling. You're not dangling that magic prize in front of him. You're turning your cold caller into a better cold caller, a cold caller that can make more money, but not somebody that you're trying to move into another role. There is zero value in bringing a cold caller into your company and trying to train them into becoming something else. So when you're interviewing and talking to them, you're hiring a professional sales development rep. You're hiring someone that's going to grow in their career as a sales development rep, not a cold caller that wants to be a help desk tech, not a cold caller that wants to be an outside sales rep. There are professional, career-based sales development executives, and that's what you're looking for, or that's what you're going to create. And either way, it's going to work out well for you. But if you start trying to make a cold caller into something else, you'll find that personality profile-wise, they're very different from sales reps. You don't want a sales rep as your cold caller. You want someone who's very detail focused. You want somebody who's going to cross the T's and dot the I's and not skip any of the steps. Sales reps don't follow process. They don't like to be held accountable for things like paperwork. Your cold caller needs to fill in all the blanks. Otherwise, the work that they're doing won't benefit you when they leave you. And eventually they'll top out, right? You got to have a sales bench because at some point it doesn't make sense for you to pay your cold caller 150 grand a year when you could be paying someone 50 grand a year who's going to perform at the same level. So at some point you've got to think about your bench and attrition. Either they top out with you and they move on to another role, or they leave. Either way, you're going to have to think about what happens next. So make sure you're thinking about your next hire always. Oops. Next. All right, so now let's talk about 2023. Again, sales forecasting, crystal ball, but let's assume now in 2023, we're all comfortable going back to on-site meetings. Let's assume we don't all suck at on-site meetings because we haven't had one in 3 years, but now we're going back to like, what did our 2019 look like? Right? Because now we've got a fully trained sales executive that works for us exclusively. They've gotten really good at their job. We've got some new numbers to look at. And again, we're still forecasting, so these aren't 100% accurate, but they're making 26,000 dials a year. They're getting better at their job, so they're connecting with more decision makers. Let's say we've got them in almost 1,200 conversations for those 26,000 dials. 80 appointments, 0 no-shows. Remember, if you're qualifying and allowing people the opportunities to back out of their meetings well before you get to the meeting stage, you don't have no-shows. Every appointment that you put on the calendar sticks. So you've got 80 appointments and 60 of them go to quote, you win 30 of them for 900 new seats of business. That's $153,000 in monthly recurring for a lifetime value of 5.6 million. And let's assume that your margins went up again. I dumped you down to 12 because I thought maybe you needed a reminder of what the pandemic year looked like, but now we bumped you back up to industry standard 18, best in class margins. $840,000 going right into your pocket. You've given your guy a raise again because you don't want him leaving. Remember, we want a professional cold caller. We're not trying to promote him into anything else, so we've got to make it worth his while to stick around. So we're either offering him more variable compensation now, or we've just raised his salary, but we want to incentivize him to stay with us for as long as possible and for as long as it's profitable. So if you're looking at the numbers here, it's still profitable to have your $80,000 cold caller. Your cost per lead is now $1,000. So don't look at how much you're paying your guy. Look at how much it costs you to get one lead. And look how much it costs you to sign that business. So if you think back to what it looked like in 2021, when it cost you $8,000, no, for appointments, it was 20, right? So it cost you $20,000 to get an appointment with your sales rep 3 years ago. Now it costs you $1,300. That math is easy. So now your cost per seat is 90 bucks. So if you want to think about how your projection moves forward, think about how many seats you want to add. You know how much it costs to add them. You know how to add people to get there. You know what year one's going to look like with a new person. You know what year two is going to look like, kind of, because now we're back in 2023 and we're all going to parties again and we're networking again and we're going to in-person meetings again. Please let that be the case. I'm assuming a lot here, but you can see the difference that on-site versus remote makes. And then what having an in-house caller looks like as opposed to having an external caller. But if you remember what the numbers look like for a regular year of cold calling with an outsourced provider, your cost per lead and cost per appointment are about what it costs you for your year two cold caller in a remote environment. So having a full-time caller is always going to make you more money than having a half-time caller. That's just math, right? But in the absence of a fully trained cold caller, you might want to think about how you would outsource your cold calling while you built out your internal team. So again, this projection made a lot of assumptions, right? It assumed that your cold caller wanted to stay with you, and it assumed that your prospects wanted to return to on-site meetings. It assumes that you gave them more money, and again, it assumes that you're not trying to divide their time somewhere else. So question, should you outsource or hire in-house this year to build your business? The answer is both. So best case scenario, thinking about what the numbers look like for next year, hiring someone, and what the numbers would look like if the numbers that I provided you with were accurate and forecasted based on a full year of remote appointment attendance and not random 3-month shutdowns and then doubling up your assets. Your investment in an outsourced caller will pay off. And it'll pay off faster than your investment in your in-house caller. But long-term, if you look at those numbers and started thinking about whether or not hiring someone would make sense to you, in a 3-year term, hiring someone is always going to be a better investment than choosing a third-party marketing agency. There's only one benefit to working with a third-party agency, and it's immediacy and skill, right? We can start today. You're 6 months away from a performing asset. My guys are ready to go right now. So my goal wasn't to convince you to outsource. My goal was to talk to you about creating realistic financial projections for next year. So if you think about what you did to set your goals for next year, did you start from a revenue number or did you start from a number of clients we wanted to sign number? So for anybody who wants to answer that question, how did you decide what your numbers were for next year? Anyone? You guys, don't make me pretend that I actually have people answering the questions. Just answer the questions. You've all set goals for next year, right? No? Okay, well, maybe next webinar we're going to talk about goal setting. Well, if nobody has any questions, I can give you back 15 minutes of your day. If you have other questions about cold calling, more than happy to answer them if you want to type them into the question box. I mean, I got surfing to do, so. All right. Nobody has questions? I'm going to give you back 15 minutes of your day. I hope you found this helpful, and I hope that you'll consider the differences between in-person and remote appointments and how they're going to affect your sales numbers for next year. If you need any help planning for next year, I am more than happy to take on a couple of consulting gigs right now. I usually look at full day or half day engagements, and obviously we are open for cold calling. So if you're thinking about what you're going to do for 2021 and you want to get started in January, I would encourage you to retain your talent now. January is one of our busiest onboarding months, and if you don't retain them now, I won't be able to guarantee that we will have an asset for you if you decide last minute in January that you'd like to onboard with Managed Sales Pros. So thanks for your time today. Appreciate you attending. Next week, we're talking about thin wedge selling, so I hope you'll join us for that. Have a great afternoon.